This is Grace. At just 13 years old, she had survived what would break most adults. An African refugee living on the frozen streets of Chicago with nothing but a tattered blanket and a hunger that never left. No family, no home, no one to fight for her future. She'd spent 6 months learning through windows because no one would let her inside. Invisible, forgotten, yet possessing a mind so brilliant it could solve equations that stumped university students. But one winter morning, everything changed. She met Margaret, the daughter of George Wick, a name whispered in fear across every dark corner of Chicago. A mafia boss whose empire was built on blood and power. His daughter attended the most exclusive academy money could buy, yet she was failing every class. And it was Grace, the homeless girl sleeping in subway stations, who became her secret teacher. But when George Wick discovered a street child teaching his daughter behind iron gates, what he did next will leave you speechless. So grab your popcorn, sit back, and get ready for one of the most shocking stories you've ever heard. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button to support more incredible stories like this one. And also, comment the name of the country you're watching from. Move along, kid. You can't sleep here. The security guard's boot nudged Grace's shoulder, not gently. She didn't flinch. She'd grown numb to the rough awakenings. The harsh fluorescent lights of Union Station burned her eyes as she opened them slowly, squinting against the brightness that felt like needles piercing her skull. I said, move. The guard's voice echoed across the marble floors, drawing stares from early morning commuters. Grace gathered her belongings, a plastic bag containing one change of clothes, a broken pencil, and scraps of newspaper covered in her own handwriting. Mathematical formulas, English vocabulary, history dates. Everything she'd learned from listening through windows. She stood on trembling legs, her thin frame swaying slightly. The Chicago winter hit her like a physical blow the moment she stepped outside. February wind cut through her threadbare jacket as though it were made of tissue paper, and the cold wrapped around her bones with cruel familiarity. People walked past. Some slowed down, some stared. One woman paused, pulled her coat tighter, shook her head with that particular expression Grace had learned to recognize, pity mixed with relief that this wasn't her problem, and kept walking. No one helped. No one ever did. Grace was 13 years old, but the streets had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with years. She didn't cry anymore when people called her names: African trash, street rat, refugee garbage. She'd heard them all. What hurt more was the help that never came, the empty kind of concern that came with a sad look and no hand extended. She'd once had an aunt, back before Chicago became her prison, before America became the place where dreams died instead of came true. In South Sudan, before the soldiers came, her aunt would braid her hair and call her little professor because Grace could recite entire textbooks after reading them once. She could speak 4 languages by age 9. She could solve math problems that made adult teachers scratch their heads in confusion. Those moments felt like shooting stars now, bright, beautiful, and gone before you could really see them. Most days, Grace couldn't even remember what her aunt's voice sounded like anymore, just that she'd vanished 2 weeks after they arrived in Chicago, disappeared into the city's chaos, leaving Grace alone with nothing but her brilliant mind and a body too small to survive winter on the streets. She tried shelters. They turned her away. No guardian, no papers, no proof she existed. Too old for some programs, too young for others, too foreign for anyone to fight the bureaucracy. So the frozen concrete became her bed, and hunger became her constant companion. But Grace had something the cold couldn't freeze, something poverty couldn't steal. She had her mind. And every morning, despite everything, she dragged her freezing body to the same place, outside the iron gates of the Chicago Academy for Excellence, where through a barely open window she could hear teachers explain the world she was forbidden to enter. Today would be different, though. Today, a black Mercedes would pull up across the street, and inside, a man with dead eyes and absolute power would notice her for the first time. George Wick was about to become the most dangerous person in Grace's life, or her salvation. Every morning, Grace returned to the same spot. Not because she was welcome, she wasn't, but because learning was the only thing keeping her human. She'd position herself by the east gate of the Chicago Academy for Excellence, hidden behind an old oak tree whose gnarled branches provided just enough cover. From there, if she pressed herself against the cold iron fence and angled her head just right, she could see into the ground floor classroom. The windows opened slightly for ventilation, and sound carried. That's how Grace built her education, one stolen lesson at a time. She learned calculus by listening to Mr. Peterson's patient explanations, his voice drifting through the crack in the window as he broke down derivatives and integrals. She mastered American history by overhearing Miss Chin's passionate lectures about revolution and civil rights. She polished her English by mimicking the debate club's practice sessions, silently mouthing arguments about democracy and justice while crouched in the dirt. No one knew she was there, or if they did, they didn't care enough to chase away one more homeless kid. Grace's mind was an unstoppable engine. It consumed every word, devoured every equation, memorized every concept. While her body grew weaker, bones more prominent, skin stretched tighter over her frame, her mind grew stronger, sharper, more powerful. Knowledge was the only wealth she could carry. On a bitter March morning, freezing rain turned the sidewalk into slick ice. Grace huddled under a soaked newspaper, pressed against the school's stone wall. Her lips had gone from pink to blue. Her fingers were so numb she could barely feel them. But inside that classroom, Mr. Peterson was teaching physics, and Grace's mind was on fire. The acceleration due to gravity, his voice drifted out, is approximately 9.8 meters per second squared. Grace whispered the formula to herself, committing it to memory, working through the implications. F equals ma. Force equals mass times acceleration. She traced the equations in the air with frozen fingers. She didn't notice the black Mercedes SUV that pulled up across the street. Inside, George Wick observed the scene with cold, calculating eyes. He'd come to check on his daughter's school security, something he did every few weeks, ensuring the walls were high enough, the guards alert enough, his daughter safe enough. And there, pressed against those walls like a ghost, was a homeless child. "Who is that?" he asked his driver, Marcus. "Homeless kid, boss. Been around for a few weeks. Harmless." George watched her for a long moment. Most men in his position would have called security, had her removed, forgotten about her before lunch. But George Wick hadn't built an empire by seeing only surface details. Something about this girl caught his attention, the way she mouthed words to herself, the intensity in her posture despite the brutal cold, the tattered notebook she clutched like it contained the secrets of the universe. Then his phone rang. Business. Always business. He forgot about the girl by the fence. For now. That afternoon, Grace's stomach drove her to a dumpster behind an Italian restaurant. She was foraging through garbage bags, looking for anything edible, when she heard footsteps behind her. 3 older boys surrounded her, blocking her escape. Street kids, but harder, meaner, the kind who'd stopped seeing other people as human. "What you got in the bag, African?" the tallest one sneered, his eyes cold and empty. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched her plastic bag tighter, the one containing her salvaged notebook pages, her pencil, everything that mattered. This was about to get very bad. "Nothing," Grace whispered, clutching her plastic bag tighter. "Just clothes." "Let's see." They grabbed her with rough hands, tearing the bag from her grip. Grace lunged for it, but the tallest boy shoved her back hard. Her belongings spilled across the wet pavement. Her one change of clothes, now soaked and filthy. The boys laughed. One kicked her shirt into a puddle. Another stomped on her spare socks. "This is trash," one sneered, grinding his heel into the fabric. But then the leader found it. The notebook. Pages water-damaged and torn, held together with string Grace had scavenged from a dumpster. Inside were months of her life, every formula she'd memorized, every historical date she learned, every vocabulary word she'd mastered, her education, her only treasure. "What's this?" He held it up, mocking. "Dear Diary?" Grace's heart stopped. "Please, that's—" He started ripping out pages. "No." The word exploded from Grace's throat. She lunged forward, desperation overriding survival instinct. The boy shoved her, hard. Grace fell backward. Her head cracked against the concrete with a sickening sound that echoed in her skull. Pain exploded through her head, white-hot and blinding. The world spun. Her vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in. Through the haze, she watched them tear her notebook apart, laughing as pages scattered like wounded birds in the wind. The rain caught them, sending them tumbling across the alley. Ink ran in dark streams, months of careful writing dissolving into nothing. Then the boys were gone, their laughter fading into the distance. Grace lay there on the cold concrete, bleeding from a cut on her forehead. Blood mixed with rain, trickling into her eye. She could have cried. Part of her wanted to scream, to rage against the cruelty of a world that took even the smallest things from those who had nothing. But she didn't cry. She'd learned long ago that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. Tears didn't bring back lost notebooks. Tears didn't fill empty stomachs. Tears didn't make invisible girls visible. Slowly, painfully, Grace pulled herself to her feet. Her head throbbed, her vision swam, but she began gathering what pages she could save, pressing them to her chest like they were pieces of her own heart. Some were readable, most weren't. She walked away, leaving drops of blood on the wet pavement. That night, huddled in a doorway while the city slept around her, Grace made a decision. She couldn't keep living like this, invisible, vulnerable, learning in scraps and shadows. She needed to be bolder, braver. She needed to get inside that school. Across the same city, in a classroom that cost more per year than most families earned, Margaret Wick sat in the back of her advanced literature class, staring at the essay question with growing panic. Analyze the symbolism in Chapter 3 of The Great Gatsby and discuss Fitzgerald's critique of the American dream. The words might as well have been written in ancient Greek. She'd read the chapter 3 times. Hired tutors had explained it twice. Nothing stuck. Nothing ever stuck. Margaret was 14 years old. She attended the most expensive private school in Chicago. She had tutors for every subject, private coaches, every advantage money could buy. And she was failing almost everything. It wasn't for lack of trying. Margaret spent hours every night reading the same paragraphs over and over until the words blurred together into meaningless shapes. She'd memorize facts, dates, definitions, only to have them evaporate from her mind the moment a test was placed in front of her. Her tutors grew frustrated, her teachers grew impatient, and her father terrified her. Not because George Wick was cruel to her, he wasn't. He'd never raised a hand to his daughter, never even raised his voice. He loved her in his cold, distant way, bought her everything, protected her absolutely, expected perfection completely. But Margaret knew what he was. She'd overheard conversations not meant for her ears, heard the threats delivered in calm, measured tones. She'd seen men visit their home late at night and leave looking pale and grateful to be alive. She'd watched her father's eyes go dead and flat when discussing business matters, like someone had switched off the human parts of him. George Wick was a monster who wore expensive suits and called himself a businessman, and Margaret was his greatest disappointment. Not because she failed classes. Her father could buy her grades if he wanted to. Money opened every door in Chicago when your name was Wick. But her grades weren't the problem. The problem was deeper, more fundamental. She was weak. In George Wick's world, weakness was unforgivable. He'd built an empire through intelligence, ruthlessness, and an almost supernatural ability to read people. He could walk into a room and know within seconds who would betray him, who would be loyal, who would break under pressure. His daughter couldn't even read a book. "Margaret?" The teacher's voice cut through her thoughts. "Your essay?" Margaret's hands trembled as she passed forward a paper she knew was inadequate. Around her, students, children of lawyers, doctors, legitimate businessmen who pretended not to know what her father really did, avoided eye contact. No one sat next to her at lunch. No one invited her to study groups. No one wanted to be friends with the Mafia Boss's daughter. She had no friends. Fear created isolation. After class, Margaret took her usual route through the school's east wing, away from the crowded hallways where whispers followed her like ghosts. She exited through a side door that led to the rear gardens, a wooded area where students rarely ventured. This was her secret place, a small clearing behind the maintenance shed, hidden by old oak trees, where she could cry without anyone seeing the Mafia Boss's daughter break down. But today, someone was already there. Margaret froze. A girl sat cross-legged on the ground, surrounded by torn, water-damaged papers, carefully arranging them by subject. She was thin, dangerously so. Her clothes were filthy, her hair matted with dirt and rain. But her hands moved with purpose and precision, sorting through the ruined pages like they were precious artifacts. Grace looked up. Their eyes met. One girl who had everything but couldn't learn, one girl who had nothing but hunger for knowledge. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I'm sorry," Grace said finally, her accent thick but her English clear. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'll leave." She started gathering her papers quickly, hands moving with practiced efficiency born from always needing to run, afraid this well-dressed girl would call security, would get her banned from the only place she could learn. "Wait." Grace froze. Margaret's voice wasn't hostile, just curious. What are you doing?" Grace hesitated. "Studying? Out here? It's the only place I can." Margaret stepped closer, curiosity overcoming caution. She looked at the paper scattered around Grace. Complex mathematical equations, historical timelines, chemical formulas, all written in cramped, careful handwriting on scraps of paper, napkins, anything with a blank side. "You wrote all this?" Grace nodded. "Where do you go to school?" The question hung in the air. Grace's eyes dropped. "I don't." "Then how?" "I listen, through the windows. I teach myself." Margaret stared at this impossible girl, self-taught, living on the streets, more educated than half the students inside the building. Then Margaret did something she'd never done before. She sat down, right there on the wet ground in her $300 uniform, and pointed at one of the equations. "Can you explain this?" Grace looked up, surprised. "The calculus problem?" "I failed that test last week. I don't understand any of it." For the first time in months, Grace smiled. "I can help you understand." And there, in a hidden clearing behind the most exclusive school in Chicago, a daughter of privilege and a girl with nothing began an impossible friendship. Grace explained the calculus problem with such clarity that Margaret actually understood it, not just memorized it, understood it. The way Grace broke down complex concepts into simple, logical steps, the way she connected ideas instead of just listing formulas, made everything suddenly make sense. "You're amazing," Margaret breathed. "How do you know all this?" Grace shrugged, embarrassed. "I just remember things. When I hear them, they stay." "I wish my brain worked like that." Your brain works fine, Grace said gently. You just learn differently. Teachers go too fast sometimes. They don't explain the why, only the what. They talked until the warning bell rang. Margaret stood reluctantly, brushing dirt from her skirt. Will you be here tomorrow? She asked. Grace hesitated. I don't want to cause you trouble. You're not. Please, come back tomorrow. Okay, Grace said softly. I will. As Margaret walked back to the school building, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. And for Grace, watching the girl disappear through the trees, she felt something equally foreign. Belonging. Neither noticed the security camera hidden in the oak tree, its lens capturing everything. And neither knew that footage was reviewed every evening by George Wick's personal security team. They met every day after that. Margaret would tell her teachers she needed fresh air for her migraines, a lie they accepted because no one wanted to question George Wick's daughter. She'd slip out through the side entrance and find Grace waiting in their clearing, papers already organized, ready to teach. Grace taught her everything, not just academics, though Margaret's grades began improving dramatically. Grace taught her how to think, how to break down problems, how to see patterns and connections. She taught her history through stories, not dates, mathematics through logic, not formulas, literature through emotion, not analysis. Why does Gatsby throw parties? Grace asked one afternoon, both girls sitting under the oak tree. Because he's lonely? Margaret ventured. Yes, but why is he lonely? Because Daisy doesn't love him anymore? No, Grace said gently, because he built his entire identity around an illusion. The American dream he chased was never real. The parties are his way of trying to recreate a past that never truly existed. Margaret's eyes widened. I never thought of it that way. In return, Margaret brought gifts, real food, sandwiches, fruit, things that weren't scavenged from dumpsters, warm clothes she'd sneak from her closet, books, notebooks, pens, things Grace treasured more than gold. Why are you helping me? Grace asked one day. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Because you're the only person who sees me as more than just my father's daughter. You're the only real friend I've ever had. Grace reached out and squeezed her hand. You're mine too. But secrets have a way of unraveling. It started small. Margaret's English teacher commented on her suddenly insightful essay. Her calculus teacher praised her improved problem solving. The headmaster called her father to share the good news about her academic turnaround. George Wick was pleased, but also suspicious. His daughter didn't suddenly become brilliant. Someone was helping her. He reviewed the security footage personally, and there, on camera after camera, he watched his daughter meeting with a homeless girl, laughing, learning, transforming. The first instinct of a man like George Wick was always violence. Remove the threat, eliminate the variable. But he kept watching the footage, kept seeing his daughter's transformation. And George Wick, for perhaps the first time in his ruthless life, felt something unfamiliar. Respect. This girl was a survivor, just like him. 3 weeks after discovering the secret friendship, George made his decision. On a cold Thursday afternoon, Margaret hurried to their clearing, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She was excited to share that she'd gotten a B+ on her literature essay, her highest grade all year. But when she pushed through the trees, she froze. Grace was already there, but she wasn't alone. Standing beside her in a black coat and dead eyes was her father. Margaret's heart stopped. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can explain." George held up a hand. "Come here, Margaret." She walked forward on shaking legs, each step feeling like it took an eternity. Beside her father, Grace stood frozen, terror etched across her face like someone watching their execution. "Is this the girl who's been helping you?" George asked, his voice calm, cold. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't hurt her. She's my friend. She's..." Teaching you? Yes. George turned his full attention to Grace. She met his eyes and didn't look away. Despite her fear, despite knowing exactly who this man was and what he could do, she held his gaze. Interesting, George thought. What's your name, child? He asked, his voice cold but not harsh. Grace, sir? Grace what? Grace Adeyo. You're not from here? No, sir. South Sudan. You have family in Chicago? Grace's voice was barely a whisper. No, sir. I'm alone. George studied her, this thin, dirty, brilliant child who'd somehow done what no amount of money could do, made his daughter thrive. Stand up, he commanded. Grace stood, her legs trembling. Look at me. She raised her eyes. Did you ask my daughter for money, food, anything? No, sir. Margaret offered. I just wanted to teach. Why? The question seemed to surprise Grace. Because learning is precious. Because she wanted to understand. Because I could help. George was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to his daughter. Go back to class, Margaret. Now. Daddy, please. Now. Margaret looked at Grace one last time, terror and apology in her eyes, then ran back toward the school building. Grace and George stood alone in the clearing. Do you know who I am? George asked. Yes, sir. Then you know I could make you disappear. No one would look for you. No one would care. Grace nodded, tears finally falling. I know. George stepped closer. The silence stretched between them like a blade. But I'm not going to do that. Grace's head snapped up, confusion and disbelief flooding her face. George stepped closer, and Grace braced herself. But his next words weren't a threat. You've given my daughter something I couldn't buy her. Confidence, understanding, hope. That's worth more than you realize. Grace stammered. I didn't mean any harm, sir. I'll stay away, I promise. No, George said. You won't. Grace's confusion must have shown on her face because George continued, his tone matter-of-fact like he was discussing a business transaction. From tomorrow, you'll attend classes here, full enrollment. Margaret will introduce you as her cousin from abroad. The staff will be informed you're under my protection. Anyone who questions it will answer to me. Grace couldn't breathe. I don't understand. You're intelligent. You'll figure it out. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Marcus, send a car to the East Gate. We're picking up a new student. He hung up and looked at Grace again. You'll live at my home. You'll have a room, clothes, food, everything you need. In return, you'll continue helping Margaret, and you'll excel in your own studies. You'll become everything your mind is capable of becoming. Why? Grace whispered. Why would you do this? George's expression hardened. Because I recognize potential when I see it. Because my daughter needs you. And because, he paused, something almost human flickering in his dead eyes. Because no child that brilliant should be sleeping in subway stations. A black Mercedes pulled up to the gate, sleek and expensive, a world away from dumpsters and doorways. Let's go, George said. You have a new life waiting. Grace followed him in a daze, barely believing this was real. As they drove away from the school, away from the streets that had been her prison, George made another call. Find out everything about South Sudanese refugee processing. I want papers for Grace Adeyo. Make her legal, make her documented, make her real. He glanced at the trembling girl in his back seat, sitting stiffly on leather seats she was afraid to touch with her dirty clothes. And get me the best trauma therapist in Chicago. She's going to need it. Grace looked out the window at the passing city, the same streets she'd walked hungry and cold, now seen from behind tinted glass, from invisible to seen, from homeless to housed, from forgotten to chosen. And for the first time since her aunt disappeared, Grace allowed herself to believe in tomorrow. 5 years later, Grace Adeo stood on the stage of Chicago Academy for Excellence as valedictorian. The homeless girl who learned through windows had become the girl who opened doors for others. No child is born worthless. Every life holds potential. With compassion, opportunity, and education, even the forgotten can rise. One act of kindness can rewrite a future. One moment of seeing someone truly can change everything. We hope this powerful story moved you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in George Wick's position? Subscribe and turn on notifications for more incredible stories. Like and share if this touched your heart. Thank you for watching.